About 6 months ago, I got trapped in a cramped alley standoff, the sort of driving situation anyone who has ever gotten behind the wheel in Chicago is familiar with. My car and another car, each trying to get by, both in each other's way. He laid on his horn angrily, this burst of sharp noise, and I was very happy to retaliate, but just when I was about to hammer down on the thing, I remembered I'm a Christian. Turn the other cheek echoed like a scold in my ear, so I put the car in reverse and promptly backed into a light pole, doing $1,400 worth of damage to our bumper. The car's been like this ever since. It is an eyesore. It's also an advertisement. Last month, my wife and I were loading the car at Costco. At the precise moment that Kelly was half buried in the hatchback, wrestling a pallet with paper towels into place, a sparkling, seedy silver car pulled up right next to us. It was as if the driver of this car were waiting for the exact moment when I was the only one standing next to it. He jumped out and he said, "I can fix that bumper for you right now. I've got the exact paint color in my truck, $300. Now, I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. I know a good deal when I hear absolutely, let's do it. Note that my significantly wiser significant other was not a part of this transaction. So we drove home, he parked his car next to ours, and he got to work. He used a small blowtorch and a can of spray paint. It took him about 8 minutes, and the bumper, when he got done, it looks terrible. I'm serious, it's in the church parking lot. You can take a look at it. It looked much worse than when you first began. So he asked for his money, and I said, "No way." That is when his gigantic friend got out of the car. Suddenly, my sweet deal began to look like it was going to turn into a scene from a Tarantino movie. So I said, all right, I'll get your money. It's in my office, right next door, at the church, where I'm the pastor. I said it to lessen the potential for violence, and I wasn't expecting what came next. A pastor? You believe in the Bible? I never know what to say when I out it as an anachronism. Christian in the modern world. I mumbled some non-committal piety, gave the man his money, and got on with my day. I wish that I had dug deeper. It's happened before. I think I've mentioned to many of you a trip that I took to a new dentist when my family and I moved back to Chicago a couple of years ago. The man asked me what I did for a living right after he put the gauze in my mouth, and I said to him, "Pastor," and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Pastor, let me ask you something. Do you believe in evolution?" Now, the man was about to stick a needle in my mouth. I would have told him I believed in unicorns if it made him happy. But even with a mouthful of gauze, it was easy to say, yes, of course I do. And I could have gone on. Creation is a painting. Evolution is the brush God wields. I could even say that with a jaw full of Novocaine. But rather than being clever, I should have been honest. I should have said, I know what's behind your question. You want to know how I can possibly believe the claims of Christianity. So do I. We've got the same problem. Every modern believer does. We know we're anachronisms. We don't need to be confronted by skeptics. We're skeptical ourselves. We've all taken 8th grade earth science. Meanwhile, most skeptics suffer the flip side of the modern believer's dilemma. They secretly long to believe. They've all seen the stars hung in the midnight sky. Do you really believe in the resurrection? You've heard that question. It's implied by the Times, even if it isn't asked outright. In fact, I hope you've asked it, of yourself at least. I have. Do I really believe in Easter? It's a tough question. There are evasive answers at our disposal. Brilliant minds have put themselves to work with precisely the aim of sidestepping this question in a fog, kind of like an octopus squirts its ink and backs away. I think the apostles mistook an inner experience for an outward fact. Jesus stayed dead, but he lived on in their hearts and their memories. Resurrection is a symbol, a metaphor. I confess that I myself have indulged in such glib superiority while apologizing for Jesus. But standing before you, standing before all of you today, I have to say, I'm done with it. I don't buy that kind of argument anymore. And even if I did, you're not here to step inside some preacher's reductionist misunderstanding of a miracle. You're here to stand before the empty tomb. I've had it. I've had it with rational religion, with attempts to make God tame, mundane, unremarkable, understandable. Sometimes it seems that we have placed Christ inside our minds, turning him over and over and over again like a rock in a tumbler until he emerges polished and smooth, pleasing and easy to believe in, confined inside the possibilities granted by our modern minds. But the most beautiful thing about Jesus is that he cannot be contained. The most difficult thing about Jesus is that he cannot be contained. The most alarming thing about Jesus is that he will not be contained. Not by the first century, not by the grave, and certainly not by the confines of our minds. Jesus is not content to live inside our understanding. He wants to live in our lives in a very real and even startling way. So at this point, here's what I think you ought to be thinking. You ought to be worried that I'm going to spend the rest of this morning exhorting you to extinguish all your doubts, imploring you to confess the resurrection as an absolute fact. I hope you're not feeling that way, because Easter is not so simple. I once heard a friend confess, I believe in the resurrection, but if I had to take a polygraph exam about my faith, I'd fail. What a ridiculous bind we've designed for ourselves. A people with two choices: deny the resurrection and attempt to build a wispy faith that rests on metaphor alone, that slips out of your grasp and crumbles the moment that you really need it, or accept the resurrection and with it put on a pair of blinders that block out the modern world. Two roads to go down. That's what it seems the church has offered us. Two roads to go down, both of them riddled with self-deception. You can have a fragile, symbolic faith that dissolves the moment you grab a hold of it, or you can have an unyielding Christianity that won't let you think for yourself. No wonder people schedule soccer games and birthday parties on Sunday mornings. What terrible options. What I long for is a faith that trusts the resurrection. A faith that trusts the resurrection. Not the kind of trust one places in a math problem or a scientific proof. More like the kind of trust a child has when he holds his mother's hand while walking across the intersection of Halstead and Fullerton at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. Mark is the oldest gospel. That's what Christine just said, and she's absolutely right. It's the first to tell us the resurrection story. It's the closest to the empty tomb. And Mark tells us that when the earliest followers of Jesus realized that Christ had risen from the dead, they didn't shout hallelujah. They were terrified, and they shook with fear. When Mary and Salome saw the empty empty spot on the floor of the tomb where Jesus' body had laid just hours before, they trembled. They scrambled up out of the darkness, panicked and eager for the safety of daylight. They were, Mark says, astonished and beside themselves. And they said nothing to anyone. What kind of faith is this? It's not a dogmatic faith that presses its adherents to swallow truths that are hard to swallow. But lest any of us feel too secure in our theological liberalism, this is not a faith that wants to explain the miracle away. Neither Mary nor Salome mention metaphor or symbol. No, instead, they trusted the resurrection. This was not faith according to today's categories, according to contemporary dichotomies, according to our terms. It owed no debt to modernity's demand that one choose either yes or no, strap me to a lie detector, and then we'll find out what I believe. The women were astounded. They recognized the boundless work of God, which defies the boundaries of the human mind. They were awestruck. They were intimidated. They were trembling with joy. They were silent. Let's try it for a moment. Sit before the resurrection and just be silent. They said nothing to anyone. Silent awe before a mystery. That is a faith to emulate. A faith that has much more in common with the way the hair stands up on the back of your neck when the trumpets hit the high notes than it does with any attempt to explain it. Don't worry if you don't understand Easter, and don't be too quick to think you do. You can't. We want to make Christ's resurrection into something tangible, something we can accept or reject, like a piece of fruit at the grocery store. You believe it? You don't believe it? Well, either way, you get to control it, subject it to our own opinions. And when God is controllable, she is no longer commanding, demanding, awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, makes you tremble in silent awe, divine. Resurrection can never be controlled or even comprehensible. Of course, we can't understand it. We shouldn't try to. Those first three Easter preachers ordained nearly 2,000 years ago today, Mary and Salome, they started in silence. They stood before the empty tomb and they let their questions and their astonishment, their incomprehension, their trembling, all these things, they let them be a testimony to the power of God. And we can do the same. And only when we do this, only when we get ourselves out of the way, only then can we begin absorbing the wonder of this day. They said nothing to anyone. Easter begins in silence. Now that may sound like a strange thing for a man standing on a riser who gets paid to talk to say. A strange thing for a man standing next to a brass quintet, a pipe organ, a gospel trio, a choir of 40, and no less than 3 percussionists to start talking about silence. But as Bonhoeffer put it, all honest talk about God must begin in silence. That's where our first 3 preachers began. They said nothing to anyone. And then, eventually, when their awe turned, they started to whisper to each other, Christ is risen. Christ is risen. He came back, just like he said he would. God is with us. God returns to us with a love that is reflected in our behavior, reflected in our incomprehension, more powerful than our minds. Jesus comes back to meet us. Jesus comes back to meet us and to talk to us, even if all we have to bring to the conversation is regret, doubt, and stammering incomprehension. Jesus still steps into our lives and says, I love you. God loves you. A love that is difficult to believe, but impossible to deny. A love that defeats the grave. A God who is alive and in the world, just as powerfully in your life right this minute as he was in the moment of that first resurrection, alive and with you, not, as Karl Barth says, as a fifth wheel on the wagon, but the wheel that drives all the wheels. Not a sacred relic set apart to be pulled out twice a year on the high holidays, or a distant notion half remembered from Sunday school 35 years ago, but someone who steps with force into the middle of everything that is. Not a dark power in the clouds, beneath which we can only either be dull, obedient little worshippers or unruly school children irritated by the power that hangs over us. But instead, love which sets us free. Not a declaration, but the lever upon which everything turns, not an idea, not a perspective, but the living power that overcomes the strength of death, as real as the power of dynamite or the force of electricity. Not a feeling with which one plays, but a force that one takes seriously, on which we feed like bread, into which we retreat as if it were a mighty fortress, and then emerge forgiven and renewed and freed. A living God, making all things new, beating back the grave, defeating your own death. A God who returns to this world, embraces us, forgives us, holds fast to us forever. And I could stand here and talk about this love for the rest of my life, and I could never explain it, and we could never understand it. And that is a very good gift indeed, because resurrection is not a problem to be solved. It's a miracle to cling to be overwhelmed by. Let it overwhelm you. Christ is risen indeed.